Let us just quiet ourselves for a moment and be still. For some months now, our congregation has been involved in a process of formulating and articulating a clear, faithful, relevant vision of what we feel United Christian Church is called to be as a community of faith at this particular time in our history. The work of the initial visioning committee, together with discussions by the church council, occasioned a congregational retreat in June. And now, with information gathered from the members of the congregation who completed the distributed questionnaire and survey form, there will be another congregational retreat in October. A retreat that will hopefully give rise to an even more involvement by members of the congregation and even more discernment as we dare to ask the question, what is God, whatever your concept of God might be, calling us as individuals and as a congregation to be and to do? I say dare to ask the question, because if we have ears really to hear the answer that might come to us, we might find the answer to be both more daunting and more demanding than we expected it to be. Remember the story recorded in chapter 17 of the Gospel of Mark, when the rich man asked Jesus what he would have to do in order to follow Jesus. Having heard what he had to do, the man, according to Mark, quote, was shocked and went away grieving because the sacrifice was too great for him. Having said all of this, know that I'm looking forward to the congregational retreat in October because I believe that we will have an opportunity to be open and to open ourselves to more creative possibilities and more meaningful responsibilities in our immediate future as we continue in our stated purpose, quote, to bear witness to the abundant love of God as evidenced in the life and teachings of Jesus by extending radical hospitality and seeking justice as a faith community. But while all that we are doing in our visioning process has to do with our future, today, I want to focus on the past. My focus will be one designed to help all of us remember the vision that is our heritage, a vision that goes back historically to the prophets of Israel, a vision that was proclaimed in the rabbinic teachings of Jesus, a vision that became the essence of Christian faith in the letters of Paul, and a vision that still informs but is also often ignored in the church today. As I do this, though, please allow me a personal moment. I have been told, with concern and affection, I might add, that in a sermon I presented last February, I presented a characterization of Judaism as a religious orientation that valued rites, rituals, and rules above compassion and caring. And what is more, that I characterized Judaism as being so legalistic in its orientation to faith that all ethical issues were quickly and simply decided by yes, no, do, don't, right, wrong categories. And while I'm quite aware that there are voices in a number of religions, including Christianity, who approach what they claim as their faith stance with just that kind of mindset, that characterization of Judaism is not at all appropriate. And that characterization is not at all my personal or theological perspective on Judaism, especially since my personal, most theologically paradigmatic figure is the Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. So I truly regret any misrepresentation of Judaism that I may have unintentionally presented. And let me say clearly that one of the guiding principles of Judaism, the Pikuach Nefesh, states that the highest of all priorities is the priority of honoring human life and the saving of human life for all persons, a priority that stands as the highest concern, even if it occasions the violation of another religious rule of the faith. So it's important for me to say that because words matter. And when you present something, you have to consider not only what you have said, but how it was received. And while intentions make a difference, maybe the ultimate difference, we become a community of love and hope and faith when we are willing to stand under one another's perceptions, one another's experiences, and to be with one another with understanding, stand under, understanding of the other's viewpoint. And when we have done things that are unintentional, but nevertheless hurtful, it is very important in the context of beloved community to own responsibility for that experience, to address that experience in an attitude of reconciliation. What is more, it allows you the opportunity for clarification, so that if you have been misunderstood, perhaps even for your own fault, you're able to make clear who you are in an authentic transparency that gives rise to meaningful relatedness. And so I say that in the context of our wanting to pursue a vision of who we want to be, and one of the characteristic marks of who we need to be is a community in which people feel free to be themselves openly, honestly, authentically, without fear, without facade, without hesitation, in the sure knowledge that they are received, valued, heard, understood, respected, and known. So whatever else we do in our visioning process, let us never forget what the essence of our being with and for one another is truly about. Now, this idea of visioning has been part of the religious tradition of both Judaism and Christianity for centuries. So let me today begin in our journey backwards into history with the great vision of Israel at the time of Jesus. Israel's great vision was grounded in the anticipation of the Anointed One, the Messiah, who would bring Israel into the fullest right relationship with God and who would bring into being, through Israel, peace and justice throughout the world. As the Hebrew scriptures present this vision in the book of Isaiah, the hoped-for Messiah would have the Spirit of the Lord rest on him, giving him, quote, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. The one for whom Israel waited and hoped would judge the poor, and the righteous with righteousness, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. The peace on earth he would bring would allow, quote, the wolf to live with the lamb, the leopard to lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion, and the fatling together, with a little child leading them. The nursing child would be able to play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child would be able to put its hand over the adder's den. For the earth would be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. But waiting for the Messiah was not the vision of what the people of God were called to be. Speaking about what the awaited Messiah would do was not the same thing as a vision of what the people should be. Hear the words of Micah 6:8, when he says, he has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And should the people of Israel think that their worshiping and their rites and their rituals were going to be enough, Amos says to them, speaking for God, if you are not doing justice, if you are not doing kindness, then I hate, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your hearts. But let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Now, this was the vision that both called into question the people who awaited the coming of the Messiah and the responsibility for justice and righteousness that was their calling. In other words, faithfulness was seen not just by rites, rituals, and worship. Faithfulness was seen by how one lived his or her life, how one pursued love and peace, how one pursued righteousness and justice. Now, many of the earliest followers of Jesus shared the same hope, even to the point of believing that Jesus himself might be the anointed one described in Isaiah's view of things. But by the time of Paul's writing, a quarter of a century after the death of Jesus, when the churches to which Paul was writing and ministering, those churches were located not in Israel, but in cities like Ephesus, Athens, Corinth, and Rome. The hope of Israel was no longer the hope of these early Christians, and the role of Jesus as the Christ being the Greek translation for the word Messiah, was no longer congruent with the Jewish view of what a Messiah would be. So what does Paul mean when he writes to the church in Ephesus and speaks of his vision of what the church should be? He says to them, I, therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. Now, what would be Paul's understanding of this one hope of your calling in the context of a theology that speaks of, quote, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all? Well, for one thing, Paul has radically redefined the traditional concept of God, so that God is not a being, quote, out there above the earth. Paul's view of God would have God be both transcendent and immanent, through all and in all, that is. This means that each person already lives and moves and has his or her being in God, and that God has God's being in each person. In this sense, every person has the potential to be an anointed one. So as Paul would say in another just lose this. As Paul would say in another context, from now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. For everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. God has given us the ministry of reconciliation, entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. So for Paul, the vision of Israel that depended on the reconciling work of one particular person, the Messiah, has now become redefined as the one hope of your calling, that he sees as the mission of anyone who follows in the way of Jesus, the radically redefined Messiah or Christ, through whom, according to Paul, we're able to become, as he states it, the righteousness of God, precisely what Isaiah thought the Messiah would do. What is more, since Paul presents the meaning of this vision in the context of Christian faith as having to do with the hope of being agents of reconciliation by seeing God in all persons, then the incarnation is no longer for the Christian to be seen as a one-time historical event that defined the sacredness of one person and that person only, but rather the incarnation is to be seen as an all-time ontological event that defines the sacredness of all persons and the sacredness of all reality, the Jewish principle of the sanctity of life above all else. This vision would mean that faithful Christians would be totally dedicated to making the old pass away with its wars and fears and phobias, with its misogyny and sexism and racism, with its tribalism and nationalism and exploitation, with its condemnations and persecutions and demeaning of one another. This vision would mean that faithful Christians would be totally dedicated to the elimination of the ignorance that rises from brokenness and expresses itself in hate and fear and selfish desire and closed-minded opinion. This vision of being agents of reconciliation would mean that faithful Christians would be totally dedicated to the pursuit of truth and justice, so that, quote, justice might roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. this vision would mean. Faithful Christians would be totally dedicated to being co-creators of a new way of being in the world. So that like a rising sun in a new day begun, history's shame and the past pain would give way to a peace that passes our understanding, a joy that heals our brokenness, and a love that makes us one with the eternal love that is God. Amen.